Chapter 1. The medieval monk who invented a cheese calendar is the year of our Lord, 1147. And the abbey of St. Sulpice, nestled in a quiet bend of the Seine River in what is now eastern France, hums softly with monastic routine. You hear it in the distant drone of a psalm, the slow scraping of a wooden rake across cloister gravel, the soft thud of a robe brushing against stone. Everything here happens slowly. That includes the cheese. You see, this was a Benedictine monastery, and like many of its kind scattered across medieval Europe, it was less of a holy fortress and more of a functioning economic unit. The monks prayed, certainly, but they also farmed, copied manuscripts, ground pigments, baked bread, brewed ale, and rather importantly for our story, made cheese. A lot of it, and among them was Brother Gerard, aged 44, bespectacled before it was fashionable, with a suspiciously precise handwriting style and an unusual passion for dairy tracking. Brother Gerard wasn't he the abbot, nor was he the cellarer who managed the food. He held no grand title. His official role was that of a scriptor, an archivist, a keeper of dull records, and even duller receipts. But it was in the margins of these parchment scrolls, half ledger, half spiritual meditation, that Gerard began a meticulous, unglamorous task, recording the relationship between cheese and time. Not metaphorically, literally. Monasteries, particularly those under the Benedictine rule, operated under strict schedules. You awoke at matins, long before dawn, followed the divine office through lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, and punctuated it all with meals, labor, and silence. Yet in between this divine rhythm, monks, like Gerard also, tended to the more earthly needs of the cloister, when to plant, when to salt the meat, and, as Gerard believed, when to start the next wheel of wash-trying cheese. Now, cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't like the vacuum-packed wedges you might. No, it was alive, it breathed, it sweated in cool cellars, and occasionally bloomed with wild molds. The monks believed in the natural rhythm of the seasons, and this rhythm deeply affected cheese. Spring milk was bright and grassy. Summer milk was rich, almost nutty. Winter milk, sparse, sometimes sour, often less fatty. Brother Gerard began to notice that some wheels kept better than others. Some went sharp and crumbly. Others bloomed in orange-tinted rinds that rivaled the monasteries. Stained glass. But why? No one else seemed particularly interested. So Gerard, modestly and without fanfare, began a project. He would write down every wheel made, the date of its creation, the cow's milk used when possible, the weather that week, and the time of its first flip. Each cheese had its own name, not fanciful names, mind you, but practical ones. Wheel 4, May 2nd, Wheel 12. After Feast of St. Pancras, he even began noting the appearance of early surface molds, drawing faint sketches. Beside each name with annotations like good bloom or split near edge, possibly to warm. And thus, unintentionally, Brother Gerard began inventing what we might call the first cheese calendar. The work was entirely self-driven. No one asked for it, but it didn't go unnoticed. The cellarer, Brother Etienne, was skeptical at first. "You're telling me the cows know it's Lent?" He'd scoff while stirring curds with a polished U-paddle. Gerard would only smile and note, quietly, that cheeses set during Lent often aged longer, since fewer feasts disrupted the quiet. Over time, even Etienne admitted that Gerard's logs were helpful. Wheels marked for Easter sold better in nearby villages. A cheese made on the feast of St. Agatha the previous year had developed a unique speckled rind that people began to ask for. Coincidence, perhaps, but patterns were forming. Gerard's parchment rolls grew longer. He developed symbols for different types of mold: asterisk for bloomy rind, triangle for split crust, a crescent moon for high-fat summer wheels that needed extra time in the cellar. He began coordinating with the other monks, gently persuading them to rotate the wheels more precisely, to monitor the cellar's airflow. A few younger brothers took to helping him. Brother Simon, barely out of his novitiate, added notations in red inkalar, coded to match feast days. They even began segmenting the cellar by liturgical season: Advent cheeses to the left, Lent cheeses to the rear, summer ordinary time wheels up front where the breeze was strongest. From the outside, nothing looked different. The abbey continued its quiet rhythm of prayers and harvests, but within those cool stone walls, the humble art of cheesemaking was becoming an early form of food science. One might ask, was Gerard inventing anything truly new? Cheese had existed for thousands of years. The Romans had catalogued varieties. Arab merchants had traded spiced goat wheels across deserts. Peasant women had passed down knowledge by gut instinct and smell. But Gerard's work was different. In one key way, it was standardized. Not industrially, of course, but methodically, reliably. His was a world of slow observation, patient notes, and seasonal awareness. And this awareness soon led to the formation of what he called the rotating chart of curd and sun. It wasn't a calendar in the modern sense. Rather, it was a circular chart divided into 12 segments, one for each month, color-coded with annotations about milk quality, weather shifts, ideal storage, and suggested pairings with bread or ale. His fellow monks referred to it simply as the cheese wheel. Brother Gerard hung it above the cellar door. Visitors from nearby abbeys began to take interest. One particularly rainy October afternoon, a monk from the nearby priory of Cluny visited and asked to copy Gerard's wheel. A week later, the prior of Vézelay Abbey sent a note requesting advice on winter rind splits. Gerard replied in quiet detail. By spring, 3 monasteries had implemented their own versions of the cheese calendar, and still, Gerard kept writing. Was he proud? Not exactly. He considered his work an extension of obedience, a virtue praised in the rule of Saint Benedict. Attend with the ear of your heart, it said, and Gerard believed that applied to cheese as well. But as the years passed, one question began to settle on his mind like fine mold on the rind of a slow-aged wheel. Could this calendar do more than record time? Could it shape it? To understand just how unusual Brother Gerard's cheese calendar became, you must understand the role that feast days and the liturgical calendar played in the medieval world. The average peasant might not know the year, or even the name of the king, but they most certainly knew when it was Michaelmas, or Candlemas, or the feast of St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, should he happen to be your monastery's patron. Time was not linear, but circular, dictated by the seasons, the saints, and the ever-repeating rituals of the Church at St. Sulpice. This cyclical rhythm was expressed in bells and bread butts, increasingly also in cheese. It was Brother Gerard's idea to start naming the cheeses after feast days. At first, it was meant only for internal reference. He noticed that a batch started on the Nativity of Mary developed a nutty finish if aged until Meticulous. A cheese begun during Pentecost matured too quickly in the summer heat, better suited to pressing and drying. So he began noting feast names alongside his other logs. Soon, a wheel might be called Assumption Round or St. Hildegard's Curd. The monks joked about it, gently, during their permitted recreation hours. But the names stuck, and something unexpected began to happen. People from the nearby village began to ask for specific cheeses by name. It started during one of the rare open market days, when the monastery was permitted to sell goods beyond the cloister. A merchant's wife from Chalon pointed to a wheel with a waxy rind and asked, "Is this the cheese from Ascension-tide?" Brother Etienne, normally terse, blinked. "It is," he said. "I'll take 2. That cheese became locally known as the Ascension Round, and it sold out that afternoon. Word spread. Not quickly, of course. This was the 12th century. But by the following year, pilgrims traveling north to Vézelay, on the way to the shrine of Mary Magdalene, began detouring through St. Sulpice. They bought bread. They bought beeswax candles. But above all, they asked about the cheese calendar. Brother Gerard, now in his 50s, was bemused. His work, never meant for wide acclaim, was now being referenced in abbeys as far as Dijon and Poitiers. One monk from Normandy even sent him a letter asking, "Is your chart a devotional tool or simply a culinary aid?" Gerard replied, "Why not both?" It wasn't all smooth wheels and buttery success, however. With visibility came scrutiny. In 1156, a delegation from the nearby Abbey of Fontenay, a Cistercian foundation known for its stricter rule, visited Saints. Their cellarer, a Dior man named Brother Alaric, expressed concern about the naming of cheeses after saints. "This," he muttered, gesturing toward the feast of Saint Amandus Brie, "borders on irreverence." Brother Etienne defended the practice, pointing to the chart as a tool of seasonal stewardship. "It honors the rhythm of creation," he said. But the real defender, quietly and diplomatically, was Gerard. He explained how each name corresponded not to sanctification, but to timing, helping monks match their labors to the changing world. "We name the days of prayer," he said, "and these cheeses are born of prayer and work alike." Still, a complaint was sent to the diocesan bishop. No punishment followed, but Jared became more cautious. He removed a few of the more whimsical names such as Curd of the Visitation and Blessed Bloom of Barnabas, replacing them with plainer designations like Mid-May Wheel. Even so, the calendar continued to evolve. By the 1160s, Brother Gerard's system had been copied into at least 8 other monasteries. One particularly industrious monk at Saint Ouen created a version with movable feasts counting for how Easter's shifting date altered the dairy cycle. Brother Simon, now no longer a novice but a full member of the order, took over the day-to-day cellar duties at St. Sulpice. He added a parchment addendum tracking which wheels sold best in each village. Cheese and commerce had begun to mingle, and still, the calendar hung quietly above the cellar arch. By now it was framed in oak, gently faded, its ink dulled by years of cellar moisture. It bore the same 12 divisions, but now included annotations. In multiple hands, a fine note near July read, "Expect stronger bloom near Feast of Magdalene." Another near November advised, "Watch for creeping mold at Michaelmasu's firmer press." Brother Gerard rarely visited the market anymore. He preferred the cloister library, where he wrote a small treatise on the dairy rhythm of the Holy Year, which no one asked for, but which he nonetheless completed. It contained notes on temperature shifts, cow grazing habits, saintly, feast day anecdotes, and even a short meditation on the virtues of patience as seen through milk. But not everyone was convinced of the cheese calendar's merit. one particularly cold spring, when several wheels went bad due to late frosts. Brother Etienne questioned the whole system. "It's just weather, Gerard," he muttered. "Not providence," but Gerard only smiled. "Perhaps," he said, "but even weather can be charted." And he did. That same year, he began adding crude weather symbols to the cheese logs. A sun for warm days, a triple wave for storms, a crochatched cloud for snow. Over time, a second circle appeared next to the cheese calendar tracking weather trends. Across multiple years, it looked like a child's zodiac, but it worked. By correlating these logs with spoilage rates, the monks refined their aging times. Summer wheels were now turned twice as often. Winter batches were stored higher off the stone floor. Simon began boiling brine in early spring to match salt content against air humidity. It was, in all truth, one of the most boring revolutions in agricultural monastic life. But it was a revolution nonetheless, and somewhere in the quiet of it all, Brother Gerard began to wonder, was this calendar still his? Brother Gerard passed away in the year 1171. During the soft blue quiet of an early spring morning, as pale mist rolled in from the river and the first wild garlic began to appear beneath the monastery walls. He was 68 years old, a respectable age for the time, and he left behind no biological family, no known portraits, and very little mention in the grand ecclesiastical records of France. But what he did leave behind meticulously, quietly, and boringly was a wheel-shaped parchment nailed to a cellar wall, surrounded by shelves of ripening cheese. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After his death, the monks of St. Sulpice gathered in the cloister walk to recite the office of the dead. They read from psalms, they sang slowly in plainchant, and then, without ceremony, they returned to their work, copying, brewing, tending bees, rotating cheeses. Brother Simon, who had studied under Gerard for nearly 2 decades, took over the cellar in full. By now he had memorized not only the turning schedules and salt measurements, but also the odd theological reflections Gerard had sometimes muttered aloud while testing brine strength. Cheese, Gerard once said, teaches humility. You may start it, but you never really control it. Simon made only one significant change. He recopied the cheese calendar onto a cleaner sheet of parchment and enclosed it in waxed linen to protect it from cellar damp. He did not decorate it with gold leaf. He did not frame it in silver, but he added, at the center, in a circle of modest red ink, the words, Ad majorem caese glorioma, gentle twist on the Jesuit motto, meaning to the greater glory of cheese. By the 13th century, Gerard's cheese calendar had become standard practice in at least 12 Benedictine houses across the region. At the Abbey of Cluny, where administrative precision was prized nearly as highly as sanctity, the calendar was formalized into a seasonal cheese chart copied into monastic annals. Pilgrims spoke of Lenten curds, and St. John's rhymed as naturally as they spoke of relics and indulgences. In some towns, specific feast day cheeses were considered good luck, especially those aged from milk produced on Marian feasts. A rumor began that St. Sulpice summer rounds never molded in storage, though this was both untrue and entirely beside the point. Elsewhere, cheesemakers began to experiment with the idea of branding cheeses around seasonal cycles. Alpine monks, near what is now Switzerland, created wheels named for high-altitude meadows and the saints whose chapels dotted the paths. Monks in Italy aged pecorino according to the phases of the moon and passed down similar calendars in local dialect. No one remembered Brother Gerard by name, but they remembered his rhythm. Ironically, his modest parchment survived long past his abbey. St. Sulpice was damaged during a local conflict in the early 15th century. Several manuscripts were lost, and the cheese cellars were briefly converted into a storage depot. The monks, scattered or absorbed into nearby abbeys, took with them only a few important objects. One of them, it seems, was the cheese calendar. It appeared again in 1467 in an inventory from the Abbey of Saint Antoine. Listed plainly, one vellum circle with feasts and curd days, hand-colored, anonymous. It passed hands several more times, always seen as a curiosity rather than a theological artifact. A copy was made in the 17th century by an antiquarian interested in monastic dietary observance. That copy, printed in a small tract with barely any readership, ended up in a forgotten university archive. It was rediscovered in 1892 by a Belgian historian named Adrien Lemaire, who, fascinated by monastic agriculture, included a small reference to the rotating cheese charts of certain Burgundian abbeys in a footnote of his monograph, and it might have stayed a footnote until one sleepy afternoon in 1954, a doctoral student named Jean-Lucille Charpentier, researching liturgical calendars for her thesis at the University of Dijon, stumbled upon Lemaire's work. The phrase cheese calendar caught her attention. Curious, and perhaps mildly hungry, she followed the citation trail, eventually unearthing a reproduction of the parchment from an agricultural monastery record dated 1683. It was circular, divided into 12 sections, labeled with saints' days, moon phases, and mold symbols. It was, unmistakably, the work of a monastic, mind-obsessive, reverent, and deeply practical. Charpentier wrote a short paper, Curds and Calendars, Liturgical Structure in Benedictine Dairy Practice. It circulated quietly among food historians. In 1971, a cheesemonger named Henry Delacourt used the term cheese calendar to describe his seasonal offering menu in a print ad, and by 1983, the phrase had entered casual use among French affineurs. Cheese, a. From there, the idea spread. Today, if you walk into certain cheese shops in Europe, particularly the older ones, where wood shelves still carry the scent of straw and salt, you might find a wheel of cheese with a modest tag, Saint Gerard or curd of Candlemas. Few customers know the names are based on anything real. Even fewer know that behind these seasonal names lies the quiet parchment work of a monk who never intended to be remembered, but he is, in a way. He is remembered every time someone ages a cheese longer because the air feels damp, every time a batch is started on a feast day because that's the good time for it, every time a cheesemonger says, "This one's best in summer," and doesn't entirely know why. Brother Jared's story is not one of dramatic change or towering achievement. It's not even, really, about cheese. It's about attention. A monk who watched the milk, who listened to the weather, who recorded the small things because no one else was looking, and who, in doing so, created something quietly durable, something shaped like a wheel. Chapter 2. The 19th century postman who walked 30 miles a day. Morning bell rings in the small Welsh town of Brecon. It's still dark outside, early, misty, and grey. A rooster crows somewhere in the valley, though no one responds. It's 1842, and the postman is already lacing his boots. You can picture him, a lean man in a wool coat, brass buttons shining faintly in the lamplight, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. His name might be Evan or Thomas or Idris, names common enough for the time, but his daily journey is anything but ordinary. He is about to walk nearly 30 miles on foot, delivering letters, notices, and small parcels across a scattered network of farms, hamlets, and slate-stone cottages. And he'll do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and again the day after that. In the 19th century, long before delivery vans and zip codes, the Royal Mail of Britain depended on a vast human network of rural postmen. Some rode horses, a few used carts, but thousands, especially in hilly or remote regions, relied on the only tool guaranteed not to fail: their feet. These walking postmen were known as letter carriers, and their lives were dictated by two things: the mailbag and the road. In towns, they might do 2 or 3 rounds per day, but in rural zones like Wales, the Lake District, or the Scottish Highlands, a single delivery loop could stretch from dawn to dusk. On foot, in snow, in fog, in silence, the Royal Mail's reputation for reliability was not just a slogan, it was policy. Missed deliveries could mean fines, dismissal, or worse, a tarnished uniform. And so the postmen became clockwork. They carried heavy canvas, bags up to 35 pounds, on some routes backed with letters, official documents, and sometimes fragile glass bottles or tins of tea. In the countryside, their delivery list might include a postcard to a farmhand 11 miles out, court summons to a thatched house on a barely visible lane, a parcel of sewing needles to a widow who'd ordered them by catalogue. 6 weeks earlier, a letter from a soldier's son, mailed from a barracks near Portsmouth, rain or shine. They walked the entire loop, often 6 days a week, through fields, forests, moors, and muddy lanes, and they weren't paid by the mile. What kept them going? The reasons varied. Some were retired soldiers or seamen used to hardship and discipline. Others were hired from within the communities they served, often walking the same routes for decades. There are stories of postmen so familiar with their roads that they knew which dogs to avoid, which gates squeaked, and which farmhouses always left a biscuit out. There's even an account of a postman in Northumberland who continued his route for 42 years, until he finally stopped, not from age, but because the government paved the road and introduced bicycles, which he stubbornly refused to use. The work was punishing, but it was also trusted. Rural postmen were, in a sense, the connective tissue of the kingdom. They brought news of births and funerals, military orders, weather updates, and yes, even scandal. In a time before phones, before radio, and certainly before the internet, the postman was a living information line. He knew who had fallen ill, who had moved, who was expecting word from a cousin in Australia. In many villages, the postman was the news. A moment of joy, a young girl shrieking with delight as he hands her a birthday card. A moment of dread, a farmer's wife, pale as she takes an envelope stamped with government red. A small moment of routine, a nod, a folded newspaper, a murmured thank you. These daily encounters, remarkable, repetitive, and quiet, made up the texture of 19th century life. And behind each one was a man in worn boots, carrying a bag heavier than it looked. But what did these postmen think about during their endless walks? They did not carry books or newspapers. There were no earbuds, no podcasts. Some may have prayed. Others, perhaps, composed letters in their head they would never write. And then there was the terrain. In Wales, a postman might cross a stone bridge, slick with moss, pass under canopies of dripping oak, or trudge uphill toward a hamlet that disappeared into fog. In Scotland, a postman's path might skirt wind-blown lochs, where the only sound was the cry of curlews and the slap of waves. In Cornwall, the narrow lanes were so muddy that some postmen carried an extra pair of stockings, changing them halfway through to avoid trench foot. The gear was minimal: wool coat, cap canvas, bag handwritten delivery booked in, of oil for squeaky hinges, slice of bread and cheese wrapped in linen, no weapon, no map, no lantern beyond the sun. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't praised, but in a way, that's what made it remarkable. Because these postmen kept going every day, every mile, every letter, without celebration, without fame, and usually without even a warm fire waiting at the end of the route. Why did they do it? Was it duty, habit, pride in being part of something larger than themselves? Perhaps it was all of those. Or perhaps, in the quiet footsteps of these anonymous men, we glimpse something else entirely. What does it mean to be dependable when no one is watching? If you had followed one of these postmen, say, along the winding roads outside Kendal, or through the stone-walled pastures near Aberystwyth, you wouldn't have found much to look at. Just a man moving steadily forward, as if tethered invisibly to the horizon. But beneath that plain routine, an entire system of rules, rituals, and expectations was at work every step, reinforcing one of the most powerful institutions in 19th century Britain, the Royal Mail. It began with uniformity. By the 1840s, postmen were issued standard uniforms: long navy blue coats in winter, shorter ones in summer, polished buttons, stiff black caps, and boots that had to be resoled constantly. Some disliked the outfit too stiff, too hot, but it made them unmistakable. Even children recognized the silhouette from a distance. Then there was the postbag, a heavy canvas satchel with an iron lock. Every bag was numbered and recorded. Tampering with the contents, even by accident, could lead to immediate dismissal or, in serious cases, criminal charges. Letters were sacrosanct. The trust in the post wasn't symbolic. It was institutional, enforced by policy and public expectation alike. No one questioned the importance of punctuality. A delay of 2 hours could set off complaints. A missed letter might spark accusations of dishonesty. One small tear in an envelope could cause gossip to spread through a village. And so, the postman followed the rules with almost liturgical discipline. Still, the system had its vulnerabilities. There were stories quietly passed among older postmasters of letters found months later, caught in hedgerows or swept into ditches during storms. One postman, after slipping on an icy footbridge near Barnstaple, lost 3 days' worth of mail in a frozen stream. He returned the next day with a long hooked pole and retrieved every single letter. Another postman was known to tie spare letters to his belt with string to prevent loss in high winds. When queried by his supervisor, he replied simply, "Trust is heavy, sir." But the greatest risk, perhaps, wasn't physical, it was human. Temptation existed. Letters contained money, orders, stamps, even the occasional coin sewn into the paper. The postal service understood this and dealt harshly with infractions. A man in Kent was sentenced to transportation to Australia for pocketing 2-halfpenny stamps. Yet for every mishap, there were hundreds of silent successes. Thousands of letters, day after day, arrived exactly where they were meant to, on time, unopened, unread by anyone but their recipient. It was, by any measure, one of the most boringly effective systems in the world. To many rural communities, The postman was more than a civil servant. He was an institution, sometimes the only link between isolation and the outside world. There are stories of postmen delivering mail through flooded marshes, snowdrifts shoulder-high, and fog so thick you couldn't see your own boots. One man in the Yorkshire Dales used a homemade wooden sled to drag his bag across icy ridges in winter. In Norfolk, a postman known only as Old Barry used to whistle a tune as he approached different melodies for each part of his route, so villagers could tell how far off he was by the sound. Another postman in County Donegal would read letters aloud to elderly farmers who could not read themselves, standing patiently by a fence, delivering not just the envelope but the message inside with care and respect. And then there were the postwomen, rarer but not unknown. Some took over after their husbands died. Others were appointed during times of war. They wore modified uniforms, walked the same routes, and faced the same weather. Their names, like the letters they carried, often went unrecorded. The geography of trust extended far beyond towns and villages. It reached into mountains, islands, and moors, where even horses couldn't tread. A postman in the Scottish Isles once rowed a boat twice a week to deliver mail to a tiny outcrop of wind-battered cottages in the Lake District. Postmen used sheep tracks as shortcuts, memorizing stone landmarks and tree shapes to navigate in mist. Some painted marks on stones to guide their way back. They learned which bridges were prone to ice, which gates froze shut, and which dogs were best approached with a firm voice and a biscuit. Most importantly, they learned the people they knew, whose hands shook when taking a letter. They knew who was waiting for news from a son abroad. They knew who had lost someone recently, and would linger a moment longer at those doors, offering a silent kind of companionship. In this way, the 19th century postman was both messenger and observer. Part of the village, yet apart from it, entrusted with secrets, joy, and sorrow in equal measure. As the century wore on, change crept in. The introduction of bicycles in the 1880s promised relief, but only on flatter routes. Many postmen resisted at first. Bicycles were expensive, temperamental, and ill-suited to muddy tracks. Some argued that a man on foot could still reach places that wheels could not. Then came the railways, which transformed long-distance mail transport but did little for rural carriers, who still had to fetch sacks from the train station and deliver them the old way, mile by mile, door by door. Eventually, uniform updates arrived. A more practical rain cape was introduced. Caps were widened to shield from sun. Shoes, instead of heavy boots, became optional in some areas. But none of this changed the core rhythm of the job. Walk, deliver, walk again. A postman in the Peak District, interviewed at age 72, said, "I've seen 3 queens, 4 new bridges, and a dozen dogs. The road stays the same." And, for most of them, it did. One wonders what these men and women thought about their work. They didn't write memoirs. They weren't knighted. Their stories weren't recorded unless they were unusually fast, unusually long-lived, or caught in some curious tale of lost mail or heroic delivery. But their contribution was quietly profound. They made the postal system work, not because they were praised, but because they believed in the integrity of what they carried. Each letter mattered, even if it only said, "The hens are well." Each parcel was precious, even if it was only a jar of goose fat. Each day was worth walking, even if nothing remarkable happened, because, in the end, the trust they carried wasn't just about mail. It was about showing up, and that too was a kind of service. By the early 20th century, the world was beginning to speed up. Railways expanded, motorcars rumbled onto the roads, telegraph wires stitched across the countryside like taut black veins. And slowly, quietly, the figure of the rural postman, once as common as the tolling church bell, began to fade into the fog of progress. But, for a while longer, they remained men and women in worn boots, still walking their routes just as they always had, delivering the post one footstep at a time. In 1901, the Royal Mail conducted a survey of its most remote routes. One of the longest on foot was in the Scottish Highlands, a 28-mile loop crossing 3 rivers and 4 hamlets. Completed daily by a man in his late 50s, he refused a bicycle, said it jostled the letters. In Yorkshire, a postwoman named Agnes Mallory carried mail across 14 miles of muddy bridleways for over 20 years, her canvas satchel made lighter only by the smile she offered at every door. She retired at 63, never having once lost a letter. These were people of habit, of quiet reputation, and they held fiercely to their roots. One story comes from Somerset, where an aging postman named Cyril was reassigned to a shorter route in 1912 to ease his burden. He refused. "That's not my round," he said. "My round knows me." There's a gentle poetry to that idea that a route could know a man, just as a man knew every hedgerow, fence post, and crack in the lane. The path became a kind of conversation between body and land, repeated endlessly until memory became instinct. But time, as ever, moved on. The introduction of motorized delivery vans after the First World War changed everything. Suddenly, what had once taken 7 hours on foot could be done in 40 minutes by vehicle. Small rural routes were consolidated. Walking became obsolete. Shoes gave way to wheels. Uniforms modernized. The postbag shrank. Many of the walking postmen were reassigned, retired, or simply let go. Some, like Cyril, accepted it reluctantly. Others, like the unnamed man in Perthshire, who burned his uniform in protest, did not. Still, a few continued on into the 1930s and even 40s, remnants of a slower time. In Wales, one elderly postman kept walking his route long after retirement, delivering nothing, just out of habit. The villagers didn't stop him. Some even gave him empty envelopes to carry. Today, the memory of the walking postman survives, only in fragments. There are black and white photographs, stiff poses of men in caps, holding letter satchels beside crooked signposts. There are stories passed down in families. Your great-grandfather delivered the telegram that announced the end of the war. And occasionally, there are footprints quite literally preserved in old stone steps, worn smooth by decades of passage. Marks left, not by kings or generals, but by men and women with a job to do. A job they did over and over again, without fanfare. What can we take from their story? It isn't dramatic. There are no battles, no inventions, no declarations of love atop mountain passes. What we find instead is rhythm, the daily, ordinary commitment to deliver, the steady footfall across fields, the unwavering presence, no matter the weather, a kind of slow heroism made all the more powerful by its complete lack of recognition. They weren't saints, but they were reliable, and in a century increasingly defined by speed, noise, and distraction, their lives offer something profoundly different: the virtue of consistency, of getting up, walking the road, and doing what you said you'd do. In a museum archive in Shropshire, There's a scuffed leather satchel from the 1880s with a brass nameplate. W. Granger, Royal Mail. Next to it is a pair of cracked leather boots with soles worn thin at the heel. They are unremarkable objects, but if you look closely, you can imagine the miles in them. The miles of rain, sun, snow, and silence. The miles of muddy lanes and wind-swept hills. The miles between letters sent and letters received. They remind us that before every message, there was a messenger, and before every mailbox, a man or woman who showed up. Chapter 3. Why medieval cooks carved peacocks for Christmas. You might imagine a medieval feast as a riot of greasy meat, spilled wine, and rowdy minstrels. That wouldn't be entirely wrong, but it also misses the quiet, strange choreography happening just behind the curtain, especially in the kitchens. It's Christmas Day. Around the year 1385, we're in a noble household, perhaps in the service of a minor baron or a prosperous merchant who's paid for a seat at court. The tables in the great hall are being set with linen cloths. Evergreen bows hang from the beams. Candles flicker. The steward checks the seating chart, muttering dot and down in the kitchen. Something remarkable is underway. A cook is carefully sewing feathers back onto a roasted peacock. It's not a joke. It's not symbolic. It's dinner in medieval Europe, particularly. In England and France, the roast peacock was among the most theatrical of Christmas dishes. It wasn't just cooked. It was presented. First, the bird was slaughtered and skinned with great care, so that the vivid blue, green, and bronze feathers could be preserved as a single sheath. Then, the body was roasted over an open fire, often basted with butter, vinegar, and wine. Sometimes saffron was added for color and scent. After roasting, the cooked body was reinserted into the feathered skin, which had been stiffened, perfumed, and in some cases gilded with actual gold leaf on the beak and feet. The result? A dish that looked like a living peacock, upright, colorful, and ready to fly, except it was roasted and ready to carve. Servants would carry it into the great hall on a silver or wooden tray, accompanied by trumpets or singers, while guests gasped or applauded. It was a bird, it was a meal, it was a spectacle. But why go to such lengths? Part of it, of course, was status. Only the wealthy could afford such exotic birds, not to mention the kitchen staff and skill required to prepare them in this way. The peacock became a kind of culinary crown jewel, showing off not just wealth, but refinement. There was also a symbolic aspect. Peacocks were associated with immortality due to a long-standing myth that their flesh never rotted. This idea came from ancient Roman beliefs and was echoed in some medieval Christian texts. A Christmas feast, with its ties to birth, renewal, and divine mystery, was the perfect moment for such symbolism. Still, not everyone ate peacock because of theology. Sometimes they just wanted to impress the neighbors. Peacocks weren't the only birds featured in this elaborate fashion. Swan was even more prestigious, rarer, larger, and harder to prepare. In fact, swans were legally protected in many regions. You couldn't just catch one from the river and cook it. Most swans were owned by the crown or licensed nobles, and killing one without permission was an offense. If a family served swan at Christmas, it meant they had connections or royal favor. Other birds appeared too: cranes, bitterns, even herons. But none quite matched the visual drama of the peacock. The cook who managed this feat was not merely preparing food. He was staging a performance. Feathers had to be brushed and shaped. Beaks might be painted. The neck could be propped upright with thin wire or pastry supports. In some cases, the reassembled bird was lit from within candles placed behind it to make the feathers shimmer in the dim hall. And then, of course, it had to be carved. Carving was itself a ritualized practice. There were manuals written for noble households on how to carve different animals. Peacock required a particular method to preserve the illusion while still offering meat. One technique was to lift the skin gently at the side, slice underneath, and return the skin like a cloak. Guests rarely helped themselves. That was the job of the carver, a trained role, sometimes even a career position, called the server or trancher. They used long, thin knives and carved in silence, their movements almost ceremonial. If done correctly, the peacock would remain upright and majestic, even as its flesh was served to guests on slices of trencher's flat, rounds of stale bread or pastry. It was, in its own way, a theatre of restraint. The bird was a display of excess, but the act of carving it was slow, reverent, and precise. Of course, not everyone was impressed. There are scattered accounts in monastic writings and letters of travelers who found the practice strange or even grotesque. One chronicler from Flanders wrote, "They roast the fowl, then dress it in its own skin, like an actor in a play. One wonders who it fools." A few clerics worried the practice bordered on vanity or wastefulness. After all, how much meat did a peacock actually offer? Not much. Its true value was never on the plate, was in the procession still. The tradition endured for at least 2 centuries. Redressed peacocks appeared at Christmas tables across Europe, symbols of splendor, culinary ambition, and the desire to turn even dinner into a kind of performance. But what happened when the bird was gone? And what replaced it when tastes and times began to change? By the mid-15th century, the Christmas feast had become a kind of stage production, and the roasted peacock its dazzling headliner. But the peacock was rarely alone. A full noble banquet might feature dozens of dishes, some practical, others purely symbolic, and a few simply absurd. These were not meals designed for comfort or even fullness. They were displays of control, artistry, and excess. And as with any performance, timing, pacing, and surprise were key. A guest at a high-ranking noble table around Christmas might encounter a boar's head, its tusks decorated with rosemary, its mouth stuffed with an apple or citrus. This, too, was a form of pageantry. The boar was hunted for sport, then paraded in death further down the table. There might be jellies, bright, wobbling constructions made from fish stock, spices, and even almond milk, molded into towers or castles. Some were colored with natural dyes, beetroot for red, saffron for yellow, boiled spinach for green. A few had layers. A few contained edible gold leaf. If you were lucky, someone would roll in a cockentricer, mythical beast made in the kitchen by sewing together the front half of a piglet and the back half of a goose. It wasn't meant to fool anyone. It was just ... impressive. But for all the culinary wonders, the bird with the feathers still stole the show. The role of the head cook in these scenarios was not unlike that of a modern-day stage director. He had to coordinate hot dishes with cold, manage the rhythm of courses, and ensure that the visual centerpiece softened the peacock interred precisely when conversation lulled. There were even hand signals for this. In royal households, a signal from the steward would cue the kitchen staff to begin assembling the presentation dish. A roasted peacock, refeathered and scented with cloves, might take an hour just to arrange. The platter had to be warmed, the feet reset with gilded twine, and the eyes replaced sometimes with black currants, sometimes with hand-blown glass beads. A pastry base or wreath of bay leaves might be used for extra flair. In particularly wealthy households, a poem was read aloud as the bird entered. One surviving example includes the phrase, "He cometh proud, in feathered might, to grace our board this holy night." This wasn't food, it was ritual. One famous chronicler of court life, Sir John Fortescue, once described the procession of the Christmas bird at Edward IV's court. The bird, a fair and noble peacock, was carried by 4 footmen, its beak painted gold, its tail displayed in full arc. Musicians played a slow fanfare on sackbuts and viols. Torches lined the great hall. The Queen's ladies stood to see it pass. When it reached the high table, the cook himself, rarely seen outside the kitchens, stepped forward, bowed, and presented the carving knife to the king. It was over in 5 minutes, but guests spoke of it for months. In this way, the kitchen and the court became partners in spectacle. The humble ingredients, bird, wine, spices, were transformed into theatre. The roast was no longer a meal. It was a metaphor, and yet, all metaphors eventually fall out of fashion. By the late 16th century, the practice of redressing birds was already fading. Taste changed. Spices became more available, and thus less impressive. More importantly, turkey arrived in Europe larger, meatier, easier to prepare, and without the aristocratic baggage of swans and peacocks. Turkeys, introduced from the New World, were a culinary reset, practical, affordable, and easily carved. The peacock, for all its beauty, simply didn't have the meat yield to justify the trouble. By the 17th century, peacock was largely gone from Christmas tables, except in reenactments or nostalgic pageants. A few curious cookbooks included instructions for dressing birds in their natural case, but by then it was more curiosity than norm. Some authors mocked the tradition. One 1621 pamphlet refers to the feathered feast as the foppish games of idle kitchens. Others mourned it. A single line from a Yorkshire diary laments, "No peacock this Christmas. I think we are poorer than last." Even as the dish faded, the idea persisted that Christmas should have a centerpiece, something ridiculous or memorable or sacred. In its place came figgy puddings lit with brandy, Yule logs carved with snowflakes, stuffed turkeys too large to lift. The ritual remained, even as the bird changed, yet the peacock left behind curious traces in heraldry. The peacock survived as a symbol of vanity and immortality. In illuminated manuscripts, it still perched beside saints or beneath stars. And in the collective imagination of England and France, it lingered as a kind of Christmas ghost, part bird, part flame, part feast. Even the kitchen manuals of the 14th and 15th centuries, long out of print, continued to influence culinary writing. Recipes for elaborate meat sculptures, for rose-scented game, for feathered platters, all borrowed from the high medieval tradition of edible drama. Today, historians studying medieval gastronomy point to these dishes not for their flavor, but for their meaning. They ask not how the peacock tasted, but what it represented. We're left with a question. Why did these people who lived without electricity, often in cold, dark winters, spend such time, labor, and wealth creating something so ephemeral? What was the point of roasting a bird, only to make it look uncooked again? It's difficult to pinpoint the last time a feathered peacock was paraded into a Christmas hall with trumpets. History tends not to mark quiet endings. Fashions slip away more often than they collapse. But at some point in the early modern period, the birds simply stopped arriving. The feathered spectacle that once commanded awe was replaced by more practical fare pies, puddings, joints of beef, turkey new, plump, and oddly exotic, became the rising star of the Christmas table. People welcomed it. It was easier to prepare, easier to portion, and crucially, it required no sewing. Meanwhile, the art of cooking with performance in mind faded. Food was still celebratory, but its message was less theatrical. It was now about abundance, not artistry. And so, the roast peacock, once a dazzling miracle of meat and plumage, retreated into the margins of recipe books and memory. But fragments survived in the archives of noble estates. Menu records still mention le peacock redress, the peacock redressed. Some include hand-drawn diagrams of how the bird was to be arranged, neck upright, tail fanned, feet gilded, in a few dusty cupboards. Metal stands shaped like peacock claws remain used to mount the cooked bird as it sat on the platter. One was found in a French chateau kitchen, another in a Yorkshire manor, both tucked among old ladles and skewers. Even the language around the tradition echoes in modern speech. When someone today says a person is strutting like a peacock, they're invoking that very image. The bold display, the confident entrance, the feathered show with nothing to prove. It's a strange legacy for a dish that people barely ate. What happened to all those birds? The answer lies partly in the changing structure of the medieval estate. As power became more centralized, moving from nobles to royal courts to professional kitchens, the display of food became less personal and more institutional. Gone were the days when a single household tried to outshine its neighbors with a flaming fowl dot in cities. Cooking moved indoors, halls shrank. Feasting rituals gave way to private dining rooms and printed menus by the 18th century. Elaborate food displays had moved to the banquet table itself, jellies shaped like towers, sugar sculptures, delicate pastry fountains. The idea of drama in food didn't vanish. It simply shifted. But the peacock, majestic, impractical, labor-intensive, couldn't make that leap. Its final appearances were often nostalgic, included in Victorian reenactments of Old Christmas, feasts or children's illustrations of medieval merrymaking. Sometimes it even appeared in holiday cards, smiling oddly cartoonish, perched beside holly in snow. The meaning was lost, but the image remained. Still, something deeper lingers beneath the feathers and gold leaf. The practice of reassembling a roasted bird inside its own skin and parading it with music and ceremony reveals a truth about how people once treated meals not simply as sustenance, but as storytelling. A Christmas feast was never just about food. It was about memory, ritual, and performance. It was a way to bring people together and remind them, in a cold world of short days and dark nights, that beauty and effort still mattered. The peacock, with its dazzling coat and near-invisible meat, became the perfect symbol of that principle. Something more beautiful than useful, more shared than consumed. It wasn't made to satisfy hunger, it was made to be remembered. Today, you won't find roast peacock at your local butcher. It's no longer bred for food. Some of the surviving medieval recipes read more like stage directions than instructions. Take the feathers and restore them upon the brown of the flesh, with threads fine and invisible. Modern chefs look on them with fascination, if not practicality. But the core idea of shaping food into a gesture, a gift, a moment of wonder is far from lost. Each time a family lights a pudding on fire, or carries in a glazed ham to a round of applause, they echo that long-ago procession of the golden-beaked bird. They honored the same impulse to turn nourishment into ceremony, to turn dinner into a story, and in that story, somewhere between fire and feather, the medieval peacock still walks, tapter. 4. The Ottoman bureaucrat who invented the coffee break-it began, as many innovations do, not with grand proclamations or royal decrees, but with a desk, a tired man, and a very small porcelain cup. We are in Istanbul, sometime in the mid-17th century. The sun is rising pale across the domes of Topkapi Palace. Courtiers stir, scribes light their oil lamps, and in a room lined with scrolls, accounts, and cracking leather ledgers, a mid-level bureaucrat named Ahmed Effendi rubs his temples and calls for coffee. He is not noble, he is not famous, but what he starts on this day will ripple through centuries, because Ahmed Effendi is tired of copying taxes while his ink freezes in the well. He is tired of the endless sitting silence, and so he takes a moment. He closes the ledger. He warms his hands around the tiny, handless cup. He breathes in the bitter, earthy steam, just 5 minutes. But the scroll can wait to understand why this moment mattered. You must understand the Ottoman court. By the 17th century, the empire's bureaucracy was immense. Hundreds of clerks, scribes, translators, archivists, and secretaries worked day and night in service of imperial administration. Taxes had to be recorded from Cairo to Belgrade, edicts translated into Persian and Greek, land grants redrawn, treaties copied. Each task required patience, precision, quiet hands. Most of the work was done in silence, overseen by eunuchs or viziers. Mistakes were not welcome. Late pages caused delays. A smudged seal could provoke suspicion. Clerks worked long hours, often squatting or kneeling over low tables, cross-legged, backs bent. The air was thick with ink, dust, and candle smoke. Meals were simple, taken late. Water was available, but tea was not yet widespread. But coffee was something new. Coffee had entered the Ottoman world a century earlier, traveling up from Yemen and Ethiopia. At first, it was a curiosity found in Sufi gatherings, taverns, and scholarly circles. Imams drank it to stay alert through long nights of prayer. Poets sipped it between verses. By Ahmed Effendi's time, coffee was no longer just a novelty. It was part of court life, though still not fully integrated. Officially, it was tolerated. Unofficially, it was everywhere, especially in the bureaucracy. Scribes discovered it kept them awake during audits. Translators drank it to stay sharp when interpreting Persian legalese. Even janissaries, off-duty, lingered at public Coverhane coffee houses, gossip and sipping from tiny ceramic bowls. But within the palace, the coffee moment remained unofficial, a habit, not a rule, until, one day, Ahmed Effendi made it one. We don't know much about him. He appears briefly in ledgers from 1652, as a scribe of third rank in the Office of Land Assessments. He was responsible for redrawing tax districts after a flood in the Aegean region. But his marginal notes, still preserved in the archives, are oddly detailed. In one, he writes, "Stopped at mid-morning. Ink to cold. Hands stiff. Drank coffee. Returned to table." In another, 3 minutes rest. Coffee helped the numbers return to order. By modern standards, these would be nothing. But for a 17th century bureaucrat to document a personal break, that was unusual. More striking still, his annotations begin to appear in other clerks' margins. Phrases like, after coffee, pause, for drink, or simply *C in the corner of a page. Ahmed's habit was spreading. Soon, the coffee tray became a common sight in the record rooms of Topkapi. Young apprentices fetched it black, hot, and bitter from copper pots, simmering over coals. They carried it on brass trays, alongside tiny bowls of water or bits of candied fig. The older scribes would nod thanks, sip slowly, and stare into the steam. The break was never long. 5 minutes, sometimes 7. But it brought a rhythm to the day. And that rhythm changed everything. Work was measured in 2 parts. Before coffee and after coffee, clerks became more focused. Mistakes declined. Meetings grew less tense. Even viziers noticed a change. At some point, no one quite remembers when the head scribe began scheduling an official mid-morning tray for the entire staff. And just like that, the Ottoman bureaucratic coffee break was born. But not everyone approved. Some conservative scholars saw coffee as a dangerous stimulant. Others feared it encouraged idleness. One imam wrote a furious treatise titled Against the Black Draught of Sloth, in which he warned that coffee would sap the will and invite apathy into the scroll rooms. The bureaucrats, of course, ignored him. For them, coffee wasn't sloth. It was survival, in a job built on repetition. The short pause, a moment to rest the hands, ease the neck, close the eyes, was the difference between sanity and despair. It was not about indulgence, it was about balance. But how did this tiny cup, this pause in the palace, become a wider ritual? What turned Ahmad Effendi's private moment into an empire-wide tradition? The story might have ended with a few scribes and their morning cups, but the Ottoman Empire, like steam itself, had a way of expanding. By the late 1600s, the tradition of the mid-morning break had seeped outward from Topkapi Palace into other branches of administration, customs offices in Izmir, tax bureaus in Damascus, city courts in Bursa. Wherever there were ink-stained fingers and aching backs, there began to appear a tray, a copper pot, and a little cup. It was never officially declared policy. But then, it didn't have to be. The break worked. Supervisors began to eventually expect a short pause between the morning's rush and the midday summaries. It wasn't called a coffee break at the time. No one used that phrase. It was simply referred to as nefs ormak, to take breath. And so, as the empire stretched its bureaucratic roots deeper into distant provinces, it carried with it not only forms, seals, and ledgers, but also the rhythm of pause. Outside the walls of administration, coffee houses were also flourishing. In the cities, they were called Coverhane, places of drink, but also of discussion. Here, men gathered not only to sip strong black brew, but to read poetry aloud, listen to news, and debate politics under low ceilings and candlelight. There were rules. Games like backgammon were allowed. Gambling was not. Quiet conversation was expected. Rowdiness was discouraged. One 17th century traveler from Venice wrote, in Istanbul, "The man who speaks too loudly in the coffee house is not scolded, but ignored." The coffee house was, in many ways, the civic twin of the bureaucrat's desk, a space where words and ideas flowed, where pauses mattered, where the act of sitting still with a warm drink became a kind of social binding. But the two worlds were now linked. What began as a coping ritual in the record rooms had become part of the daily structure of Ottoman time. And in the court itself, things evolved by 1700. The Kövesi Bakırşehir coffee maker had become an official palace position. This man oversaw the procurement, roasting, grinding, and serving of coffee to the Sultan, his advisors, and, increasingly, the bureaucrats who staffed the administrative engine of empire. It was not a trivial role. Coffee preparation was serious business. The beans had to be roasted slowly, never scorched. They were ground with stone mortar, not metal, to avoid bitterness. The resulting powder was brewed directly in water, often with a cardamom pod or a single clove for scent. No milk, no sugar. Just the pure, black bitterness of labor itself. The Kövesi Bakır held a small staff of assistants who served in rotation. Their trays were polished daily. The cups were hand-painted. Each man knew which official preferred his brew strong, which needed more cooling time, which took its scalding and quick. In this way, the act of serving coffee became a quiet language of respect. Ahmed Effendi, by then an old man with a thinning beard and a trembling hand, had become a minor legend among scribes. He never rose above mid-rank, but everyone knew his name. Effendi of the steam, they joked. His original cuppa, small porcelain piece with a chipped rim, was kept in a drawer, not used anymore, but shown to new clerks as a kind of relic. He died in 1693. No plaque was made, no statue carved, but in the month after his passing, an anonymous junior scribe made a small note in the office ledger, tucked between expense items. Today we paused and drank. We remembered the one who first let us breathe. That was the closest thing he received to a eulogy. Outside Istanbul, the tradition kept spreading. In the provinces, different officers began to adapt the coffee break in their own ways. Some added sweetened fig syrup. Others paired it with dried apricots or slices of almond bread. In colder regions, clerks warmed their hands on the copper pots before pouring. Eventually, non-Muslim scribes, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish officials in imperial service adopted the same rhythm. They brought it into community schools, tax stations, libraries. The coffee break became, in essence, a cultural constant in a diverse and sprawling empire. And by the early 18th century, foreign visitors had taken note. European diplomats commented with some confusion that Ottoman clerks ceased their tasks for 5 minutes each morning to partake of black infusion. French observers called it le repos noir, the dark rest. Some mocked it as superstition. Others tried it and never went back. One German visitor wrote in 1724, "I do believe their pause for coffee is why they live longer than we do." It was more than a drink, it was a gesture of dignity. But nothing lasts forever. By the 19th century, the empire was in slow decline. New Western administrative methods were being adopted. The pace of bureaucracy quickened. Typewriters replaced inkwells. Electric lights replaced candles. Yet even amid this change, the coffee break endured. It was shortened, reshaped, sometimes replaced with tea. But the pattern work, pause, return remained part of the clerical soul. Even today, in modern Turkish offices, a small copper pot on a side burner is not unusual. Nor is the habit of standing, stretching, sipping, then sitting again. It all traces back to a wary man with a ledger and a chipped cup. But how did this modest pause in an Ottoman scroll room become the template for coffee culture worldwide? The story of coffee's rise from private relief to public ritual did not end with the Ottomans. Instead, it quietly crossed borders, ports, and ocean spilling not just beans, but behaviors. By the 18th century, coffee had spread to Europe in earnest. Venice had its first coffee house in 1645. Paris followed in the 1670s, Vienna in 1683, London in the 1650s. But what most people overlook is how coffee arrived, not in the hands of traders alone, but through Ottoman couriers, clerks, and customs officers, many of whom brought their habits with them. In some of the earliest European coffee houses, the staff were Ottoman or Arab immigrants, or people who had once served as translators and merchants in the Eastern Mediterranean. They prepared the drink not as a novelty, but as a daily pause, a habit, not a delicacy. The European coffee house evolved along slightly different lines. In England, it became a place of loud debate, business transactions, pamphlet distribution. In France, a salon for philosophy. In Austria, a cafe for music. But the rhythm of pause remained the clerk who ducked out of the counting house for 10 minutes, the scholar who sat with his notebook and a bitter brew, the diplomat who paced outside a cafe until his nerves settled enough to write. Each echoed, whether they knew it or not, the small ritual that Ahmed Effendi had performed centuries earlier, closing the ledger, wrapping fingers around a tiny cup, and letting the brain breathe. In the 19th century, as industrialization took hold, the coffee break took on a new role. Factories didn't have the same rhythms as palaces. There were no ledgers, only gears. No scribes, only workers. But even the most mechanized of labor required moments of rest. And again, coffee appeared. In Sweden and Norway, the concept of fika emerged, a workplace pause for coffee and small cake. It wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged, even regulated. In Germany, the cafe pause entered the language, and in the United States, by the 20th century, the coffee break had become institutionalized. It was part of union negotiations. It became a right, a worker's breath. By then, the ritual had gone global, but its origin, still quietly Ottoman. Even the design of the modern coffee break retains shadows of its bureaucratic ancestor. The tiny cup, originally a finjen or sezvin, Ottoman style, has echoes in the espresso demitasse of Italy. The copper pot still appears in Eastern European cafes. The pairing of a small drink with a sweet, straight from the palace tray, but perhaps more enduring than the details is the philosophy that taking 5 minutes to reset is not laziness, but structure. That silence and scent have a place in labor. That you are not a machine. You are a person who needs steam to rise, rest to think, and small rituals to remain human. In Istanbul today, you can still find cafes in the old bureaucratic quarter, near the old sites of the divan and the chancery halls. Some still serve coffee in the old way, unfiltered, thick, with grounds settling at the bottom of the cup like ink in a well. Some say, if you read the grounds just right, you can see into the future. But perhaps it's more useful to look into the past, to remember a man, neither grand nor noble, who looked up from a column of dusty numbers, called for a drink, and allowed himself 5 minutes. He did not know he was changing the world. He only knew he needed to. Stop. Chapter 5. The Pharaoh's dentist and his golden toothpaste. Imagine you're waking up in Thebes around 1400 BCE. The sun is beginning to rise. Over the eastern desert, palm shadows stretch across the Nile. The sound of reeds brushing against boats fills the morning air. You reach for a sip of cool barley water, yawn and wince. A sharp pain jolts from the back of your mouth. Toothache. If you're lucky, you're not a farmhand or bricklayer, but a scribe in service to the temple. If you're even luckier, you have access to something few others do. The pharaoh's personal dentist, his name, probably lost, but his title, chief of the tooth physicians of the palace, and his toolkit, bone, probes, beeswax, linen, string, and something not unlike modern toothpaste, a golden gritty powder made of powdered ox hooves, burnt eggshells, rock salt, and frankincense. Yes, the ancient Egyptians not only practiced dentistry, they were remarkably early to the idea of oral hygiene, though it wasn't always pleasant. To understand the pharaoh's dentist, you must first understand the state of Egyptian teeth. For all their innovations, the ancient Egyptians had terrible dental health. This wasn't due to sugar. Refined sweets didn't exist in daily diets, but rather the grit in their bread. Egyptian flour was made with stone-ground methods, often using sandstone or granite querns. Over time, these stones would shed tiny fragments into the grain. The result, bread that ground your teeth as much as it filled your belly. By age 30, many Egyptians had worn enamel nearly flat. By 40, most had exposed pulp, cracked molars, or abscesses. Teeth didn't usually fall out, they simply rotted from the inside. Painfully and slowly. Enter the dentist. Dentistry in ancient Egypt was not a standalone profession like today. Most tooth doctors were also general healers, often attached to temples or trained as scribes in medical texts. The most famous was a man named Hesira, who lived around 2600 BCE and held the title Great One of the Dentists. His tomb, uncovered in Saqqara, includes wall inscriptions praising his mastery of treating the mouth. A rare honor by the time of the New Kingdom, palace dentists had become their own class of specialized priest healers. They worked closely with other medical officials, the physicians of the belly, gastroenterologists, the keepers of the nostrils, ents, and even eye men. But the tooth doctors were particularly prized. A pharaoh suffering a molar abscess could barely speak, let alone govern, and so their treatment, however experimental, became central to court life. The pharaoh's dentist would likely have had access to the Ebers Papyrus, a sprawling medical text compiled around 1550 BCE. Among its 700 remedies are dozens related to the mouth. For tooth pain, crush dried barley, mix with incense, place in the hollow tooth. For rotting gums, honey, ochre, and green malachite, applied with linen, to make the breath sweet. Myrrh and natron, dissolved in beer, swished at dawn. One particularly interesting recipe contains gold leaf and crushed garnet, meant not for healing, but for ritual purification of the mouth before speaking prayers to the gods. Imagine brushing with a shimmering metallic powder, believing it aligned your voice with divinity. Not every patient received this treatment, but the pharaoh. Absolutely. The dental tools themselves were basic but effective. Archaeological digs in Memphis and Deir el-Medina have uncovered small bronze, scalpel-thin bone needles bow drills, likely adapted for draining abscesses, tweezers for extracting debris, and spatulas for mixing powders. Tooth cleaning was more scraping and packing than brushing, but it worked at least temporarily. Mouthwash, meanwhile, came in many forms. The most common, a decoction of palm, wine, and herbs, strained through linen and swished, or sometimes gargled loudly to impress one's neighbors. Some versions included crocodile dung, others used pomegranate rind. There was no concept of bacteria, of course. The idea was to purify the mouth, both physically and spiritually. But what of the pharaoh himself? Tutankhamun's mummy, when x-rayed, showed multiple impacted molars and severe dental crowding, possibly a cause of his poor health. Ramses too had a full set of teeth at death, but many were ground flat. Several pharaohs had visible dental surgery, including what appears to be early bridge work, using gold wire to tie loose teeth together. It wasn't effective long term, but it showed an understanding of stabilization, of pain relief, of intervention, and in the palace, dental care became part of court routine. Records from the Temple of Karnak suggest tooth specialists made rounds weekly. Servants were trained to prepare paste. Pain complaints were logged alongside headaches and dreams. One entry reads, "The scribe of the scroll room did not appear at morning meal. He was treated for ache behind the eye, traced to a rotten molar, astringent herbs applied. Blessed be the toothman." Yes, toothman. It might not sound elegant, but in ancient Egypt, that could have been a life-saving title. And so, in a kingdom that worshipped cats, embalmed ibises, and lined their tombs with scented oil jars, it is perhaps no surprise that they also revered the mouth, both as a source of power and a frequent source of misery. But what happened when even the golden paste failed? When the tooth cracked down to the root? And what could be done in a world without anesthetic? By the time a courtier made their way to the toothman for the second time in a month, things were usually past the point of powders and honey. The mouth throbbed. Swelling distorted the cheek. The abscess had likely burst or was close to doing so. At this stage, the goal was not hygiene, it was survival. Tooth infections could spread. Without antibiotics, an untreated dental abscess could cause fever, delirium, or death. In rare cases, the infection moved into the brain. The ancient Egyptians may not have known microbiology, but they knew this much: bad teeth could kill. And so, when all else failed, they did what you're probably dreading to hear. They pulled it out. The tools for tooth extraction were rudimentary. The most common was a curved bronze hook, small enough to slide behind the tooth space. Sometimes bone tongs were used, rough pincers that fit poorly in the hand, but well enough around. A molar, there was no anesthetic at best. The patient was given beer or fermented palm wine beforehand, both for numbing and courage. In temple medicine, they might also burn herbs like blue lotus, believed to reduce pain and induce drowsiness. It helped, slightly. Some patients were laid flat, arms held gently by attendants. Others sat upright on reed mats, gripping wooden staffs or prayer beads. Scribes wrote later that patients sometimes screamed aloud, invoking gods like Thoth or Base for mercy mid-procedure. The dentist would whisper chants as he worked. Not magic, just comfort. The moment of pulling was fast, brutal, effective, sometimes. Pharaohs were not exempt. They didn't scream, at least, not in the records. Royal dental work was done in the most private areas of the palace. The tools were cleaner, the linens fresher, and the pain relief stronger, sometimes involving opium, resin, or mandrake. One famous case involves Amenhotep III, who reigned in the 14th century BCE. Statues of him show a swollen jaw and narrowed lips. Letters between physicians reference the pain in the left side of the divine face, and orders for shipments of honey and stone root, astringent herbs used to reduce inflammation. It's believed he had multiple teeth, extracted late in life, possibly contributing to his sluggish final years. But the most fascinating detail: in his tomb, next to his canopic jars, Archaeologists found a small gold wire, twisted delicately, consistent with the binding of a loose tooth. It wasn't placed in his mouth, it was placed beside his heart. What does that tell us? Perhaps nothing, or perhaps that even in death, the pharaoh's mouth, his speech, his smile, his pain, was still symbolic. In ancient Egypt, the mouth was power. There was even a ritual called the opening of the mouth, a funerary ceremony, performed to allow the deceased to eat, speak, and breathe in the afterlife. A special tool, shaped like a small adze or blade, was touched to the lips of a mummy, mimicking the restoration of vital forces. For kings, this ritual was sacred, and so it's no great leap to imagine that a well-tended mouth in life was seen as essential to one's journey into eternity. The pharaoh's dentist, then, was not just a healer, he was a guardian of continuity. For ordinary Egyptians, dental care remained practical and local. Village healers mixed their own pastes, often using crushed sycamore bark or vinegar-soaked dates. Children were taught to chew sticks from the Salvadora tree, a practice still common in parts of the world today. Those who could afford it visited temple clinics, where mouthmen applied warm poultices to jaws, or used fish bones to pack gum wounds. But pain was part of life. It's estimated that most Egyptians over 30 had experienced significant dental discomfort. By 40, it was chronic. And while a few lucky ones kept strong teeth into old age, many more simply learned to speak with a wince, eat on one side, or stop smiling altogether. Yet they endured. And so did their oral rituals. Burial records even show peasants buried with small packets of tooth powder, or with pomegranate peels tied around their necks, believed to ward off jaw pain in the afterlife. One worker's tomb in Deir el-Medina includes a painted image of a man offering a small brush to a woman, the earliest known depiction of something resembling tooth cleaning in art, even in modest homes. Oral care was present, if humble, because whether you were a pharaoh in a golden collar or a potter's son with sand in your bread, your teeth connected you to something larger: speech, food, breath, the gods. But what happened after death, when the voice was gone and the mouth sealed forever? Could even a golden powder preserve your place among the stars?